So, enough from me. We have 4 wonderful people who are here to share stories and experiences with us this evening. And our first speaker is Stephen Epp. Stephen is a very passionate guy, and one of his main passions is creating opportunities for people to live beyond their illnesses and recover meaningful lives through individual, group, peer, and community-based approaches to living. He has a very long title. He is the Occupational Therapy Practice Coordinator for Mental Health and Addictions with Vancouver Coastal Health. Do you want me to say that again? He's the Occupational Therapy Practice Coordinator for Mental Health and Addictions with Vancouver Coastal Health. What that really means is that Stephen is a tour de force advocate and an educator for what we call trauma-informed practice, meaning he really helps people incorporate their traumas and the experiences that they've had into making their lives better and being able to live and move forward, and helping the healthcare system incorporate all of that into the care approaches that Vancouver Coastal Health provides. Enough verbiage from me. Stephen, we're honored. Welcome. Please come to the stage.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about trauma and traumatic experiences. Some of the content can be a little bit overwhelming, a little bit heavy. I'm going to be sticking around at the end if anybody has any questions or want to check in with me. And if that's okay, I'm going to jump right into it. So traumatic events happen to all people at all ages and across all socioeconomic strata in our society. These events cause terror, intense fear, horror, helplessness, and physical stress reactions. The impact of these events does not simply go away when they're over. Instead, traumatic events are profound experiences that change the way children, adolescents, and adults see themselves in the world, see themselves and their world. The key aspect of that phrase is the bolded part, a forced change in the way people view their world. If you see around here, you'll see a number of images. What are they? See a car accident. Car accidents are a very interesting example of a traumatic event that are very confusing for our body. That's certainly an example of a traumatic event. What else do we see? Katrina. So Katrina is an interesting one. When we look at the top left, it's a natural disaster. It's an example of a thing that we would think of as a traumatic event. Natural disasters actually don't tend to cause a great amount of traumatic effects after them. Communities tend to rally together. The event tends to be blamed on nature. Or God, or something larger. Katrina was a little bit different, the one on the right. Who was blamed for Katrina?
George Bush.
Yeah, it becomes one of those, George Bush and the government became blamed for that experience. And what that did was it completely transformed and changed the impact of that event. No longer was it about blaming nature, but it was about blaming an institution. And one of the things that we see with traumatic events is that if the institutions that we expect to come and help aren't perceived of as doing their role to help us, it changes the game. It changes the way you walk down the street. It changes the way you go into a grocery store. It changes the way you trust the traffic lights to change when they're supposed to change. It's actually considered one of the more, we consider it the second, not to rank trauma, but institutional trauma or trauma from institutions is thought of as deeply impactful and almost as impactful as when people close to us are the perpetrators of trauma in our lives. And you can see how both of those examples would change the way that you function in your world. What else do you see? War and 9/11. We could probably tie those two together. We've certainly learned a lot about war, about soldiers. 9/11 is a very, all of these are tragic events, and I don't mean to be theoretical around them, but 9/11 taught us so many things about trauma. 9/11 was the first event that we learned that people could have traumatic effects through a television. We didn't know that until after that event. We're now about 15 years later, and in their mental health system, I'm now meeting people where seeing that event on television was the start of their experience with mental health issues, and that their whole system, their whole structure, their whole fears, their anxieties are tied into government, tied into that of seeing that event on television. We also learned interesting, although tragic, things around who survived that event. We learned things like More men than women survived the event. The theory around it is that women tended to befriend. Their stress response during the event was to find their friends and tackle this together, wait for Betty or Joe and try and solve this together, where men tended to fight or flight. They tended to get themselves out or fight their way through, and tragically, that caused a big discrepancy. It helps us to understand that by learning and understanding what's happening as a consequence of stress in people's biology, it helps us to understand what our clients are going through as they're going through our system, what our families are going through as they're going through getting care, what our staff are going through while they're trying to provide care. It gives us all sorts of insight and wisdom into how we can try and make that journey better, make the environments better. We see an example of a child. That's a common one that we think about as traumatic events. The younger you are, the less wise you are. We think of that as having a possible greater impact. The bottom picture is that of a residential school. We could look at that as an example of institutional trauma. We use that as an example of understanding why folks coming from a First Nations background struggle to engage with our institutions, struggle to receive the same kind of care and engage in the same kind of health care that we see or that we want. What I mentioned was a forced change. I didn't say that it was always negative. I like to think of it like a fork in the road. So you're going along in your life and a traumatic event happens. It forces you to change your perspective. There's two roads. I've described the negative road before, but there's also the other side of the road, the side of the road that we often don't talk about, we don't think about, we aren't even aware of, and we're starting to now have way more literature around it. And that's the side on the bottom, which is now being coined post-traumatic growth. And if I were to ask you guys, would you value wisdom? Would you value growth? Or would you value empathy or grit? Most people would say yes. Well, how do you learn empathy? How do you learn wisdom? How do you gain the ability to, when we talk about our healthcare system, we talk about a group of, in our mental health system, a group that has an immense amount of empathy. And when we start to drill that down, it's often adversity, traumatic events with support that harnessed that event and created empathy, created the growth that has made them possibly choose this as a part of their career. We obviously have the top one, where traumatic events can cause fragmentation. When you break your arm, if it's supported, does it grow back the same? Who thinks it grows back the same? Does it grow back worse or better? Better. It adapts. It responds to the stressor and tries to become better. That's what we're talking about with post-traumatic growth. When we look at our system, our prevalence rates are incredibly high within the mental health and substance use system, to the point where we call it universal precautions. There's 3 slides there. The first one, the vast majority of people coming into our system have traumatic events in their history. We view coming into our system, the process of either becoming mentally ill or even coming to a diagnosis or receiving care, as a trauma. It is an overwhelming life experience that forces you to change the way you view the world. And then we also see folks within our system after they, as adults, being at higher risk to violence and trauma. Understanding the neurobiology, which I've alluded to, helps you to understand the perception of people. I talked about this a little bit. Now I'm going to go into it a little bit in more detail. There's this theory now called the polyvagal theory that says, in general, we go through a hierarchical process when during stress. Our first response, if a cheetah were to come running down the thing, which I hope is very unlikely, is that we would rely on each other. We would befriend. And you would know that. You would know that if you're in danger right now by my cranial nerves, by my facial expressions, by me exuding energy and cues that you're safe. We learn that when we're infants through our mirror neurons in an attachment orientation with our caregivers, right? If we don't have that, we don't learn to rely on it. Trauma without support creates fragmentation. That fragmentation means we don't trust people. We don't trust each other. We don't trust the collective. If that isn't available to us, that befriending response. Then we go into what's commonly known as the fight-flight response. And most people have heard of that response. That's that diverting of blood from the digestive organs to our big muscles to mobilize us to fight or flight. It's incredibly important, incredibly valuable at survival. It allows us to survive great things. If that isn't available to us, we have this amazing capacity to shift gears and go into a freeze or surrender response, which does a number of things. In this relationship up here, the cheetah and the impala are in a stress response. The cheetah is as much stressed as the impala. And if that impala, if its body says that fight-flight isn't working, it has the capacity to instantly drop down into a surrender or a frozen response. And it does that for, we think of maybe 3 or more reasons. One, maybe it can hide. Most historically, predatory relationships were chasing. So maybe we can hide. And you can see, in Lauren Green's New Wilderness or whatever those shows are, a little bunny frozen, it can't run, it can't fight, so it goes into this frozen response. The second part, if that cheetah swats us, if the perpetrator or the trauma hurts us to a point where we can't fight or run, it allows us to stop and maybe gain some time, because that cheetah isn't going to calm down if we keep fighting or we keep running. Right? And then the third one is the idea that maybe this is an empathic global way of transitioning into death. I'm not going to focus too much on that one for this one. But the idea is, if the system keeps fighting, the person keeps surrendering. The deeper down you go, the harder it is to come back up. When I look at recovery and building meaningful lives, I don't want people who've surrendered. I want to help them come back and build the fight back in. The deeper down you go, the farther up you have to go. Now, this is an example of what's expected following a traumatic event. Don't have to read it all. They're all the symptoms, right? This is a normal adaptive process, especially in the first 3 months following a traumatic event. If it sticks around past 3 months, then we start to worry and we want to start getting help and support to try and recalibrate, to start to recover. But these are expected. They all have a purpose for people. So when I think about a place like GF Strong, where people may have broken their spine or gone through a head injury, this is what we would expect. This is what's healthy and normal, right? Often those folks struggle because they are showing signs of aggression, showing signs of not engaging. That's far, from a recovery standpoint, better than being surrendered, right? This book is one I would recommend. It's called Upside, The New Science of Post-Traumatic Growth. And these are the factors that we see that seem to angle that arc towards growth. And we've got examples of that downstairs in your thing. You've got people, quite a bit of stuff around art and creativity. There's a direct link between creativity and art and successful transitioning of trauma into grit and wisdom. And that's that flexibility of thought, that ability to harness it and to look at the world in a different way. Remember, trauma causes a forced change in perspective. Art, by definition, allows you to explore different ways of perceiving things. You've got social support and bonding relationships. There's, once again, downstairs, you've got family connections. You've got family support, peer support. Those kinds of things draw people out from the surrender, out from the fight-flight, into the befriending response, which is where you can learn and grow. You've got a number of other ones. Trauma-informed services take into account an understanding of trauma in all aspects of service delivery and place a priority on the individual's safety, choice, and control. They create a culture of nonviolence learning and collaboration. We're working hard to try and look at where people exhibit the stress response in our care system, where people don't feel connected, and trying to build it in and change it so that we can create safer spaces for people. There's 5 main initiatives, and then I'm going to finish up. Do I have 2 minutes? 1 minute? Modify the environment to promote feelings of safety and calmness. We're trying to do this throughout our system. People most often don't describe our system as calm and safe. We're working to do that. Modify workflows and processes to reduce re-traumatization, to reduce that our system, unfortunately, the perception from clients and families is that they're needing to use a fight-flight response or a surrender response to get through it. We want to change the language of care from what's wrong with a person to what's happened to the person. That's a massive shift in understanding. from symptoms to adaptations. We want to empower staff to be well, resilient, and aware. They chose this profession for a reason. They chose this setting for a reason. It's to use and harness those experiences in their lives. And then most importantly, to empower clients to find safety, to rely on befriending, to learn or reclaim skills, to build supports, and ultimately to enable the wisdom in those wounds to rise up and help people contribute to our world. These are some other guides that you can get to if you want to learn more about this model and what we're trying to do across the province and across the country. And if you have questions, you can email me or come and talk to me at the end. So thank you.
I promise you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of Stephen. I know I've already got some in my mind, and I love the shifting of the frame from what's wrong to what happened. I like that.